Welcome to our final episode, I should say, of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library, at least for this first series. We're going to begin again in the fall. We'll do another series of 10. But for the meantime, not that I have run out of treasures, but for the moment, we're going to just let things rest, and we're going to come back to this series in the fall. I have an interesting selection of pieces that I'm going to share with you today. And let's hope I get through them all of them fascinating. I'm sorry? You can't see me? Ah, there I am. Okay. Here I am. I can't argue with that, right? I've been highlighted. Thank you all for joining me, by the way. I appreciate all our live viewers. Although we have many hundreds, even thousands of viewers on the YouTube, I appreciate very much the fact that people watch me live. And I want to add something very important. You should subscribe to the YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on YouTube, there is an opportunity in the lower part of the screen to click, and you can subscribe to my channel, and then you will be notified of any new videos that come up online, and you'll be able to watch them directly on YouTube when that happens. In addition to which, I'd like to thank all of my Baker Street irregulars, all of those people who send me snippets of information and ask me questions and offer me opportunities to go down new rabbit holes of exploration and research. I appreciate that very much. If you have any nuggets of information with regard to oddities of Jewish history, I always appreciate that, because I have means and ways of getting into all kinds of nooks and crannies of Jewish history, which perhaps the ordinary researcher doesn't. And particularly if you have pamphlets or any handwritten documents relating to episodes of Jewish history which are perhaps less explored than the mainstream ones, I would appreciate knowing about them, and perhaps they will feature in a future lecture of mine or on one of these episodes in Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. So with that, let me introduce you to the first piece. To how many people watching this video have ever heard of a city in England called Hull, Hull? I wouldn't suggest to you that it has the same resonance as a Jewish center as perhaps Jerusalem or Vilna or Warsaw or even New York or London. Nevertheless, Hull was actually home to quite a number of well-known and learned rabbis, and a wonderful Jewish community, at least for the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And before I'm going to introduce you to this piece, I want to introduce you to another piece which I discovered, which I keep alongside this piece and various others that are associated with it. And it's a book it's a pamphlet called Ma'archei Shmuel, Koilel Chidushim V'Ha'ores B'Halocha V'Agoda Mesukim. Beautiful, sweet pieces of novella and other assorted information with regard to, no doubt, very important parts of the Talmud and the Torah. And Miyad Hashem Olai Hiskil V'Chanani Oisi Hatzoir. Here's the name of the author, somebody I know nothing about. I'd love you to research him and tell me more about him. His name was Shmuel Menachem Brod. Shmuel Menachem Brod. And as you can see here, Choyne Po Kehilas Hull, spelt Hey Vov Lamed Lamed, the Medinas Britannia. Baal Machabes Sefer Yalkut Menachem. Hull, this is where it was printed. And it was printed by a well-known London book dealer called Zeilingold. Zeilingold was the main book dealer and bookseller for Sforim, Sifrei Kodesh, and assorted items relating to Divrei Kedusha, including Tefillin and Mezuzahs and Talesim and Tzitzis and anything like that. I didn't know him. He died, I think, in the 1960s, by which time the East End of London had more or less collapsed as a Jewish area, and they, in fact, threw out the contents of his store into skips outside the store, and people were rummaging through the skips, these dumpsters, to see whether they could find anything of value. Terrible, absolutely terrible. And I knew his son. His son worked for the Jewish Agency, and his daughter, tragically, was killed fighting in the Old City for the Haganah during the War of Independence. That was Zeilingold. Now, but Brod, I know nothing about. Shmuel Menachem Brod, very often in these obscure pamphlets, the authors will tell us a little bit of information about themselves because they want to leave some type of lasting impression on the world. But Shmuel Menachem Brod did not do that, and therefore Ma'archei Shmuel remains a mystery in my library. Perhaps you can enlighten me if you know something about the rabbinate of Hull. In the meantime, by the way, this was a complete digression. I didn't mean to speak about this, but I thought perhaps I should just let you know that Hull was a place where rabbis were writing pamphlets with Divrei Torah. That's interesting in and of itself. But the pamphlet I wanted to bring to your attention is this one. Kuntras lahavdil bein hatomei uvein hatohor. Here it is. The author was a man called Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. He also wrote various other svarim. One of them, none of them, but by the way, which I remembered or even looked at today, but I'm sure you can find them on Hebrew books. One of them, I think, is in 2 volumes. I have various copies. Doresh Tov L'Amoi, a play on his name, on the word, his name was Mordechai. Doresh Tov L'Amoi is the description of Mordechai at the end of Megillas Esther. But this particular pamphlet, which I picked up many, many years ago, it must be at least 25 years ago, Lahavdil ben Atomei uven hatohor, is fascinating because it's a story. Generally speaking, Svarim or Kuntresim are not about stories, they're about topics. Sometimes, and that's always what interests me, they are about a story. And this is a fascinating story. In 1913, a group of Jewish families in Hull bought a former church, a church that had closed down on a street called Cogan Street in Hull, which is in the north of England. It's the industrial area of England. It's on the coast. I believe that one of the MPs there was somebody with whom I was briefly friendly called Peter Mandelson, who was a friend of Tony Blair. He's now Lord Mandelson. I don't know what he does. But it's a working class area. It was a port city in the industrial north of England. And there was a Jewish community there. And there were 13 families who bought this former church on Cogan Street. They began using it as a synagogue. This in and of itself is not as controversial as you might think, because places of worship can be reconsecrated in Jewish law to be used for shul. That is not an issue. Just because they happen to be in a particular location doesn't mean that you can't use them. And if something is a church building, as long as you have removed anything that conveys the concept of Christianity, or by the way, any other religion that it may have belonged to, it doesn't matter if it was a Hindu church or Hindu temple or a Muslim mosque, it makes no difference. You can use a former place of worship and reconsecrate it as a synagogue. That in and of itself is not controversial. In any event, this location in Cogan Street in Hull became known as the Central Synagogue. Quite a fancy name. Sometime afterwards, the members of this shul, I don't know if it was still the 13 families or others, discovered that below the church, at some point in history, they had used the location to bury Christians. Now, are you allowed to daven in a shul which is on top of a crypt in which Gentiles are buried? Now, they had a rabbi. His name was Yaakov David Luria. He was the rabbi of this central synagogue in Hull. He later was a rabbi in Glasgow, and he went to a man called Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. We're going to hear much more about Rabbi Daiches in a minute. But Rabbi Daiches, he also went to a man called Rabbi Simpson, who was a rabbi in Leeds. He's an interesting man, by the way, because he lived very unusually for his time to the age of 98. He died in 1951. He was born in 1853. And they lived in Leeds. Leeds is not far away from Hull. And obviously Rabbi Luria didn't feel that he could paskin the shaila. And he asked Rabbi Daiches what his opinion was with regard to this synagogue continuing its use as a synagogue, whether it was halachically permissible to daven in such a shul. Rabbi Daiches ruled in the affirmative. He said, absolutely not a problem, no problem whatsoever, you can daven in such a shul. Now, in 1920, so that's 7 years after this shul was built, and some years after the shaila was asked to Rabbi Daiches, a new rabbi came to Hull. And his name was Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. And after he was informed of this situation, he made an investigation, and he discovered it wasn't one or two bodies, that there were hundreds of bodies, literally a cemetery below this church. And he began to question Rabbi Daiches about his psak. Innocently. He's the rabbi in Hull, he's the new guy on the block, and he sends a letter to Rabbi Daiches, and he says to Rabbi Daiches, how is it possible that you can have given such a heter, such a dispensation? Surely it's not appropriate to have a shul on top of a cemetery, for all kinds of reasons that he went into halachically. Rabbi Daiches refused to withdraw his dispensation. Instead, he issued a pamphlet. And the pamphlet is here. It's called Taharas HaKodesh. Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches belligerently defended his psak halacha, and on the front here he says, Al dvar taharas ukedushas beis hakneses asher be'il ir Hull, and it gives she'ela be'inyan tumas koyanim. He focuses on the concept that for the sake of kohanim, priests, people from priestly descent, who generally speaking are not metame lemesim, they will not contaminate themselves with ritual impurity by coming into contact or going into a cemetery where there are dead bodies. He said this shul, because it's Gentiles and not Jews, there is no reason whatsoever for a Kohen not to daven there or to do anything there. That's the focus of this pamphlet. And he wrote an erudite teshuvah, a responsa with regard to this matter, in which he completely dismissed the objections of Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. Let me show you a picture of Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. Here it is. It's Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. We're going to hear more about him as well. And Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. I want to tell you a little bit more about Rabbi Daiches before we delve more deeply into Rabbi Schwartz's pamphlet and into the situation in Hull and how it was resolved, or actually not resolved. Rabbi Daiches was born in a place in Lithuania called Darshoniskis, or Darshonishok is how we call it in Yiddish. And he was absolutely brilliant as a child. He's one of these child prodigies who became well known as an Ilui. He studied Talmud at a very young age, and the rabbis who taught him all noted how great he was. For example, he studied under a man called Rabbi Yeshua Diskin, who was a Rav in Kovna. That's where he learnt with him. Later on, Rabbi Yisroel Diskin was the Rav of Brisk. And later on, he moved to Yerushalayim. And we all know the Diskin orphanage and the Diskin family in Yerushalayim that is descended from Rabbi Yisroel Diskin. He held very highly of Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement, who was nifter in 1883, he knew Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches as a young boy. Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches was born in 1850. His father was a dayan on the Beis Din of Rabbi Yisroel Salanter in Vilna. And he came from an extremely distinguished family, and he himself was a distinguished Talmudic scholar. But he chose not to go into the rabbinate. Instead, he went and became a businessman when he got married. But as was the case with, sadly, quite a number of people who went into business in Eastern Europe in those days, at some point, if they weren't very sharp and very on top of their game, they lost all their money, either because it was stolen from them by Gentiles, but much more often because it was stolen from them by Jews. And in that situation, in the year 1885, Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches, he was now 35 years old, was forced into the rabbinate, and he became a Rav in a place in Lithuania, and he remained in this place until the year 1901. Why is 1901 important? So he writes a very interesting story. In the year 1879, he had a son who died very shortly after he was born. They had registered the birth, but they didn't register the death. As a result of which, in the year 1900, he was compelled to go to the army. The problem is he was no longer alive. So this 21-year-old, not really, boy, was being pursued by the Russian army, and it would soon be discovered that his father and mother had failed to register his death, which was a felony offence, which I guess at the very least would have amounted to a huge fine and possibly a prison sentence. So Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches escaped from Russia, from Lithuania, into Prussia, and accepted a job as the Rav of the Beis HaMedrash HaGadol in Leeds, in England. Leeds was at that time a thriving Jewish community. It's in Yorkshire, in the north of England. It was quite a, not just a vibrant community, but it was a wealthy community, a well-to-do community. Beis HaMedrash HaGadol was the biggest shul in the city, and he was a massive Talmud Chacham, and he became the Rav. He was by now 51 years old, and he remained the Rav of Leeds, the most significant rabbinic figure, not just in Leeds, but in the whole of England, until he passed away in the year 1937. I have to say, and I just want to stress this, that he was possibly the most eminent rabbinic scholar ever to have lived in the United Kingdom. Possibly Dayan Abramsky was his equal, and of course we've mentioned Rav Hillman, and maybe there were 3 or 4 others who we could suggest were his equal in their halachic acumen and their knowledge of Talmud, Yerushalmi, and Bavli. Note I mentioned Yerushalmi. Do you remember we discussed a few weeks ago in one of the episodes a man called the Ridvaz, and that he wrote a perush on the Yerushalmi like Rashi and Tosfos? He wasn't the only one, because in fact we have a Yerushalmi from, I'm just going to find it here, we have a Yerushalmi from Yisroel Chaim Daiches, which he published while he was still not a rabbi. At that stage, he was still a businessman. In the year 1880, you see here, he published a Yerushalmi Bobakama, Talmud Yerushalmi in Perish Nesivos Yerushalayim. And it's quite an incredible sefer. It's not known at all. Nobody looks at it. It's such a shame, because it's full of pearls of wisdom and knowledge. The people who endorsed this sefer, I'm going to show you some of those names, and we're going to have on the video, we will have a scan of this title page with the endorsements, the endorsations. One of them is from Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Spector of Kovna. Note that he was writing a haskama for a balabos, because Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches was not a rabbi, nor did he have a yeshiva. He was a balabos, a businessman. And he writes here, Rav Shalom u'bracha el kvod yedidi harav hagoon hamafrusim chorif u'baki b'chadrei Torah Yisroel Chaim Daiches. That's from Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Spector, the greatest rabbi of the era. Alongside is another haskama, this one from the Beis Halevi, Rabbi Yosef Dov Berb and Rabbi Yitzchak Ze'ev Halevi Soloveitchik. Just below is a haskama from the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin of Volozhin, the Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin. We've spoken plenty about him as well. Then we have a number of other haskamas. I want to mention the interesting one here is from Israel Hildesheimer, who at that time was trying to establish a yeshiva in Russia. He was singularly unsuccessful. A yeshiva which was going to be identical with the Hildesheimer seminary, which eventually he established in Berlin. But he was chased out of Eastern Europe, which is why he went to Germany. And in this, let me show you. This is the Tzuras Hadaf of Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches' Yerushalmi. As you can see, you've got the Gemara in the middle. You've got a Rashi and a Tosfos. In the same way as the Ridvaz did it, so Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches did it. He came out with two other volumes. This was already in England. He wrote, this one was on Baba Basra, Yerushalmi, again Yisroel Chaim Daiches. And here he reprints the Haskamas, adds another one. And the same format, although it's slightly modernized, because here you have the square print, the Ksav Ashuris version of Gemara, much easier to read, but the same idea. Rashi, Tosfos, Nesivos Yerushalayim on the side. And finally, he came out with another volume, his final volume of this version of the Yerushalmi, which was on Baba Metzia. So he came out with the three Babas on Yerushalmi. This is Yisroel Chaim Daiches, and he has here a Haskama from Yosef Zechariah Stern, who was the Rav in Shavel. Now, happens to be, I'm very lucky, because this copy that I bought of Yisroel Chaim Daiches' Yerushalmi on Baba Metzia happened to belong, if you look here you can see it, happened to belong to Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, who was later on the rector, the head of the Berlin seminary, the Hildesheimer seminary. Here you have again his if you look here in the corner, you can see his stamp. And not only that, I have Hagos from Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. I'll show you one. On the Sefer of Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. Here it is. Can you see it there? This is Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg writing Hagos on the Sefer of Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. So he was an extremely distinguished Talmud Chacham, and I have a picture of him. This is a picture of him which is taken by his grandson, David. David Daiches. I'm going to talk more about him in a minute. There's Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches, the Rav of the Beis HaMedrash HaGodol in Leeds, the Mechaber Svarim. He wrote as well Droshes Maharich, and he wrote Yalkut Maharich, and he was an extraordinary Talmud Chacham and a great rabbi. I have to tell you that when he arrived in Leeds, the other Rabbonim were so concerned because he was so distinguished in his learning that they protested that he had no right to be the rabbi there and that he was encroaching on their territory. Two of his principal enemies were Rabbi Simpson and Rabbi Yoel Leib Herzog, who was the father of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Herzog and the Mechutin of Rabbi Shmuel Yitzchak Hillman. he was a Rav in Leeds. As a result of Rabbi Daiches coming to Leeds, he left eventually, and he went and became a Rav in Paris, where he remained until the end of his life. He died, I believe, in 1934. So they initiated a high court action against Rabbi Daiches when he became the rabbi there, saying that he was encroaching on their territory. They lost the action, and they had the support at that time of Chief Rabbi Herman Adler, who said that as far as he was concerned, Rabbi Daiches was an appropriate rabbi for Leeds. They lost the court action. Now, I have to say that Rabbi Daiches' scholarship can never be debated or second-guessed. He was a Talmud Chacham par excellence. The fact that he is forgotten today does not in any way diminish his status as a very great Talmud Chacham. But nevertheless, he was a very controversial public figure and rabbi. In fact, he was considered to be such a makil, so lenient in his halachic decisions, and he got into so many arguments with other rabbonim in Leeds and in the north of England, that Leeds became known as Ir Hanidaiches. Ir Hanidachas is a city which is completely involved in Avodah Zorah that needs to be destroyed according to Torah law. And the nickname for Leeds was Ir Hanidaiches because he was considered so lenient that it was believed that he was undermining Judaism in Leeds. By the way, he had two very interesting children. One of them was Samuel Daiches, who was one of the editors of the original English translation of the Talmud that's known as the Sonsino Shas. And he was a lecturer in Talmud and codes in Jews College in London. And he had another son called Salis Daiches, who was the Rav of Edinburgh in Scotland. Now, he had a son. Salis Daiches had a son called David. David became completely irreligious. He totally rejected Judaism. But nevertheless, he remained in close touch with his grandfather. I was, in fact, in touch with David Daiches, and he was the one who sent me the picture of Rav Daiches. He's passed away about 10 years ago. He was an expert in English literature, and he lectured in English literature, Shakespeare, etc. for many, many years in, I believe, Reading University. I didn't look it up before I began this episode. That you can look him up, David Daiches, Daiches. But much more importantly, I'm sure for many of our viewers, he was the definitive expert on Scotch whisky and wrote a book about Scotch whisky, which is used to this day. It was written 30, 40 years ago, but it has become the Bible of Scotch whisky drinkers. Anyway, I want to read you something that was written by David Daiches. He was a fantastic writer, and he wrote a book, memoirs, about his life. Very, very interesting. It's called Two Worlds. Really, the book is about his relationship with his father. So David and his father had a very curious relationship. As you can imagine, his father was the Rav of Edinburgh and was an Orthodox rabbi, although he was certainly floating on the edge. And David had completely gone off the edge and was no longer involved in day-to-day Judaism. And the book, Two Worlds, is really a description about David and his relationship with his father. But inter alia, he talks about a visit or visits that he had with his grandfather, Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches, in Leeds. I've just got one quote here, which I think is fascinating, because obviously, not only did he not read the memo about how one is meant to describe a great Talmud Chacham and somebody who is highly respected as a rabbi, possibly he read the memo and ignored it. And here's what he had to say about his grandfather, Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. His conversations with me violently contradicted the impressions of an aloof patriarchal character with which I could not help associating him in general. He had a great fondness for low jokes. I knew he was the world's leading authority on the Jerusalem Talmud, and that he had produced a noble edition of it with a large Hebrew commentary surrounding a tiny island of original text. So I naturally expected words of profound wisdom to fall from his venerable lips. Instead, he would inquire whether I went to the bathroom in order to drink brandy and smoke cigars secretly, or he would suggest that the 65-year-old charwoman was pining for me to take her to the pictures. I was prepared for him to throw a question at me concerning my Hebrew knowledge, and had even got up one side of a long dialogue in that language on which I was ready to embark if only he would give me the opportunity. But when I appeared, he would close his book, ask me to bring him a cigar from the cupboard, and proceed to make joking or teasing remarks about kilts and bagpipes, or about girls or clothes or other unrabbinical subjects. And so it goes on. I'm not going to go on reading, but essentially David is saying that his grandfather had the common touch and was certainly not somebody who had conversations with him in the way that he might have expected. Now, I told you that Leeds was known as Rabbi Daiches. That was long before the Psak Halacha of Rav Daiches about the synagogue on Cogan Street in Hull. Because in 1912, even before that synagogue was built, he came out with a pamphlet called Mikveh Yisrael. And it's a very, very rare pamphlet. Mikveh Yisrael, I don't know if it's on Hebrew books, I haven't checked. Certainly the piece I'm going to show you in a minute isn't. And it is, he was asked by a bunch of people, and he says it's Dvarim ha'odim al ha'perek. It's very important I answer this question. People want to build a mikveh, and it's very hard for us to build a mikveh without using the pipes. Can we use the pipes which are provided by the water companies in Leeds to fill our mikvahs with water? And he paskined, yes, you can. Now this later on became a huge controversy in America. I spoke a few weeks ago about Rabbi Amsel. One of the big fights that Rabbi Amsel got involved in was the mikveh in Seattle. And you can look this up online, where they did use pipes to funnel water into the mikveh, saying that it wasn't possible for them to collect rainwater in the way that perhaps it should have been collected, but that this was totally okay, relying on certain dispensations and leniencies. But this is long before then. And at that time, a mikveh was not considered a place which was difficult to attract people to. People who kept Taharas HaMishpacha would go to the mikveh, whatever it looked like. But Rav Daiches said, nah, it doesn't matter, don't worry, just use the regular water from the tap, fill the mikveh, and you're good to go. That's this Sefer, Mikveh Yisrael, this pamphlet. Now, what's less known is, and this I don't believe that this is even recorded anywhere, this is Kuntras Ein Yisrael from Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches. Kuntras Ein Yisrael, v'hu miluim lesifri Mikveh Yisrael lahatshuva sheitfasti sham oidos hamikvois asher b'medinas Anglia sheitzeisi le'or b'chodesh Shvat dahai shosehi shnas tofresh ayin beis po Leeds. And in here, he defends himself against his detractors. Many detractors came out against him, saying, how is it possible, Rabbi Daiches, you great man, you Talmud Chacham, how is it possible that you have allowed such a travesty, a mikveh, to be used with piped water, and that it should be kosher? And he defends himself very, very strongly, and at the end of it, he adds a drosha for Rosh Hashanah. He obviously had more paper, and he added the drosha of Rosh Hashanah. This is not a known pamphlet, very, very rare. Let's come back to Lahavdil bein hatomei uvein hatoher, this synagogue in Leeds. So, Lahavdil bein hatomei uvein hatoher was Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz's reaction against Rabbi Daiches' pamphlet Taharas HaKodesh. Neged HaKuntras Taharas HaKodesh, look at this, he adds a little, can you see that? A little question mark after Taharas HaKodesh. Shel Harav Agor Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches Leeds. And he answers it. No, he doesn't just answer it. And by the way, it's extremely well put together. And Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz was no cut lekanya. He was a great man. He had, they say, many smichas. He was extremely erudite, and he totally demolished Rabbi Daiches in this pamphlet, saying he's got no idea what he's talking about. In fact, what he did was he went back to the original Rav. If you look here, Rabbi Yaakov David Luria, he wrote a letter to him. Rabbi Luria wrote to him. At that stage, he was already in Glasgow. He wrote to various other people saying, how is it possible? For example, he wrote to the Chofetz Chaim, although the Chofetz Chaim's letter is not included here. He wrote to a number of other great Rabbonim all over Europe, and they all agreed with him that it was not relevant to listen to Rabbi Daiches, and as far as they were concerned, that shul was totally inappropriate and should not have been built over a crypt, over a cemetery, even though there were Gentiles buried, and that they cannot fathom how it's possible that Rabbi Daiches allowed such a shul to exist and to continue to exist lechatchila. One of the most interesting letters in the entire pamphlet is from none other than Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi, Isaac Halevi Herzog. At that time, the chief rabbi, here you are, can you see that? At that time, the chief rabbi of Ireland. And I mentioned earlier that Rabbi Daiches and Rabbi Herzog's father had already crossed swords much earlier on in 1901, when Rabbi Daiches had come and become the chief rabbi, or the rabbi of the Beis HaMedrash HaGodol in Leeds, and the leading rabbi of the north of England. And Rav Herzog clearly did not hold Rav Daiches in very high regard, despite his great erudition and scholarship. And here he writes a letter, and he says, Adayin kosheli lichtov harbe, ach hu inyan she'enoi tzorich shum arichus. He says, I can't write very much at the moment. However, this matter doesn't need any great length. I agree completely with what you're saying. That this shul, that is built over the burial places of Gentiles, who dover osur umeshukutz, it's forbidden and disgusting, umutuv lifnei amokim, and despicable in front of God, v'lifnei Yisrael, and in front of the Jewish people. V'lo nireh v'lo nishma davar mechur kazeh. I've never heard about such a disgusting thing, that a synagogue should be built on top of a cemetery. What an utter disgrace. That's the letter from Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog to Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. In any event, as a result of this, by the way, I have an interesting copy. You can see it here. This one was a personalized copy that was sent by Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz to a colleague of his called Rabbi Pinchas Yaakov Gerber. He was definitely one of the Kanoi Rabbonim of London. He tried to start his own shchita. Even after they'd settled between the chief rabbi and the Machzikei Hadas at the beginning of the 20th century, Rabbi Pinchas Yaakov Gerber had tried to start off his own shchita. In any event, in this letter, it's unbelievable. He says that he can't understand, Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz writes, he can't understand how Rav Hillman and his Beis Din had agreed with Rabbi Daiches that the psak halacha about the shul built over a cemetery is okay. How does that make any sense? How is it even possible that such a travesty could be allowed? Now, I do understand, because right at that moment, Rav Hillman was in the middle of his battle with none other than Yosef Shapochnik, who I've mentioned previously. And Rav Hillman needed all the support he could get. And rather than get himself involved in the crossfire about some obscure synagogue in Hull, Rav Hillman needed to make sure that agunas were not going to be permitted to remarry and allow mamzerim in the Jewish nation. And therefore he was willing to overlook Rav Daiches' kula with regard to the synagogue in Hull, so that he could enlist Rav Daiches' support in his battle, in Rav Hillman's battle against Yosef Shapochnik. So even though in this letter Rav Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz expresses complete surprise, bewilderment, that Rav Hillman would support Rav Daiches, I do understand it. You know, history gives you a great perspective. But let me read you some of the choice things that he says here. He says as follows. V'zeicher ledova ki mapolahu. I've got a hint to this as to what is going on here. I've got a sign, a way of telling you what it is that's going on here, how it's possible for the London Beis Din to support Rabbi Daiches in this disgraceful psak halacha. And the hint, the word he uses is mapola, mem, pei, lamed, hey. What does mapola mean? Downfall. It means something which is destructive. Rosh Tevis shel Beis Din Hanal, because mapola is a Rosh Tevis, is an acronym for the Dayanim on the Beis Din in London, Rav Hillman's Beis Din. Mendelssohn, mapola is Mendelssohn, mem, Feldman, pei, Lazarus, lamed, and Hillman, hey. All four of those rabbis were on the Beis Din, were the Dayanim on the Beis Din of Rav Hillman, and the acronym of the first letters of their name is Mapola, which is downfall. The Harosh Shelohem hurts, who Hamapola, and the head, the chief rabbi, makes it the downfall. So it's not just a downfall. Hey added the letter hey from Hertz, makes it the downfall. Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz was not happy that Rav Hillman and his Beis Din were supporting Rabbi Daiches, not involving himself in politics. By the way, Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz was interesting for another reason. In 1916, when Rav Kook was brought from Switzerland, where he was in exile from Eretz Yisrael as a result of the First World War, to become the Rav of the Machzikei Hadas, Rav Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz protested, said, "How dare you bring Rav Kook? I'm the Rav of Machzikei Hadas." Why would he be the Rav of Machzikei Hadas? Because after Rabbi Werner, Rabbi Avram Arba Werner, died in 1911, he became the de facto rabbi of Machzikei Hadas. He used to sit there all day and teach Bachrim, and he would answer shilas, and he assumed that he'd become the rabbi of Machzikei Hadas, but he was never appointed. He may have been given some money for it, but he was not the rabbi of Machzikei Hadas, and he got into a whole discussion 5 years later when Rav Kook came, and eventually Rav Kook went and was mafayas him and said, "No, it's not. Don't get upset. Of course, you're welcome to stay here, and you're welcome to give shiurim, but they want me to be the rabbi because I have an international reputation." Whatever it was, he managed to calm him down, and afterwards he became the Rav in Hull. In 1920, he moved to Hull where he was the Rav. Now, what happened to this story? Well, Rav Daiches didn't take this lying down, and he published another pamphlet in which he completely demolished, or tried to demolish, Rav Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz. And it's a much longer and more detailed pamphlet in which he explains how it's possible. Again here, Le'inyan hadinim muter la'asos mi beis tefillah shel noitzrim beis tefillah liYisraelim lehispalel. This is Taharas HaKodesh Kuntras base. It's the second part, and he even includes here a letter from the Rogatchover to support him. The Rogatchover was the Rav in Dvinsk, and even though earlier on in his battle with the Rabbonim who were against his mikveh psak, the Or Sameach of Dvinsk had written against Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches, nevertheless, the Hasidic rabbi of Dvinsk, who was the Rogatchover, he supported Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches in his battle over the shul in Hull on Kogan Street. And Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz decided, you know what, I've written what I've written. If they want to keep their shul open, they can keep their shul open. I'm just never going to go there. And he davened in the other shuls. There were other shuls in Hull. He remained the rabbi of Hull, and he continued to daven in the shuls that weren't built over cemeteries, and that shul continued to function. What happened? What was the end of the story? Very interestingly, the central synagogue of Hull on Kogan Street was destroyed by a direct hit from a German bomber during World War II. So the question as to whether or not you can daven in a shul that's built over a cemetery became somewhat academic, because it was no longer practical, the shul no longer existed, and in fact within a few years the community no longer existed and had completely diminished into very, very small numbers I knew one, I must tell you, I've only ever met one Jewish person who was from Hull. His name was Israel Feinstein. He was a judge. At one point, he was the president of the Board of Deputies. And we did discuss this incident and various other historical episodes from Hull. But I'm not aware that there are any great Jewish emanations from the community of Hull. So I think I've covered all the bases here with regard to Rabbi Yisroel Chaim Daiches, Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Schwartz, and the whole Jewish community, as well as many other things that were connected to it. And with this, I'm going to end this series of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. I thank you so much for participating with me over these 10 episodes, and I look forward to you rejoining me for the second series of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library, which we will begin in the fall. Thank you so much for joining me.